Welcome to Shucks About Everything, a literary podcast with your host, Sean Kilpatrick. Episode 3, Sunken Beauty, on Incarceration, with guest Rebecca Gransden. Have you ever spoken to a murderer?
In my early 20s, I corresponded with a guy on death row for a while, not due to any attraction to killers, which is a silly thing. The opposite, if anything. More a fascination of knowing about people who've been through extreme experiences. His crime was bad, as it would be for a death sentence. He committed it with another guy who he said took the lead. I've no reason to disbelieve that. The letters stopped after a while. I'm not sure what happened. Maybe my letters were censored for some reason. I remember one of his letters had messy writing, as his arm had been broken in an incident in the prison, so he'd been forced to use his other hand to write with. What I remember, he had a strict military background. He sent a photo of him posing in his uniform. He mentioned a dog he had, named Thor. I remember being impressed by that. Something mighty name. He'd include some drawings in his letters, and he was really talented. One was of a rose. Last time I looked him up, he was off death row and serving life. Having grown up on an island, being surrounded by a body of water, there's an awareness of being cut off, always in the background. There are prisons here. It makes sense. An island is the perfect place. One way on, one way off. Water's a barrier, makes it harder to leave. I've known a few prison officers, hard to avoid coming into contact with people connected to the prisons here. The contempt for prisoners comes across sometimes, especially certain types of prisoners. I can understand how things fester just below bad outcomes. Nearby there's a stretch of land named, I think, Dead Man's Island or Dead Man's Cove. Thick clay mud. Marshland being gradually worn away by seawater. Years ago, bones started to be uncovered as the mud was being eroded. It ended up being a burial site. Whole skeletons slowly revealed, rotting coffins breaking away. One of the theories on who these people were is that they were convicts, and disease broke out on the boat before they even left, and they'd never made it to where they were supposed to serve out their sentence. Think about how they got there and why they were buried in such a number and buried in such a rushed, unthinking way. Banishment pops up as a theme in my fiction these past years. I'm interested in it as a form of punishment. My loosely science fiction themed novel starts with the main character sentenced and thrown out into a very harsh future Earth. Darkened skies, barren wastelands, lots of howling sandstorms. There's something about banishment that is trying to be fair, I think. That the person has done something so heinous, it's impossible for them to stay supported by the community in which they've been living, and that community hands over a chance to them by not taking the person's life, leaving it up to the gods. The flip side is that the accused might be facing a fate worse than death. That's always a matter of perspective, and there'll be those that embrace survival, want it above all else, and those that will falter in the face of their suffering. One of the first ships to make the journey over to Australia was full of female prisoners, sentenced for very low-level crimes like thievery. The thinking being that there would be a civilising influence in what was essentially an act of social engineering, as well as plundering a new land for its resources with a cheap workforce with the prisoners that were planned to be sent there. It's very often the case that the sentence did not fit the crime. It was mere convenience that these people were sent that far and away from everything they knew. This and the case of Alexander Pierce led me to think about how maddening it must have been to have all connection forcibly ripped away like that. Connection to all that is familiar, your roots, your land. It's different from making that choice voluntarily. I mean, people choose to relocate all the time, but to have someone from outside dictate that for you is an extreme form of cruelty. Uncredited appearance. Through a door, in a silent room, under trees, this light. Beat your head again, bash your brains out over those unknown, when your stern brow is dashed. A ship made of lilies slivers along the silver. Land lashings break away your back, my hands bent to bones, holding the rope tether you tied yourself up in, while you float and let the twine bloat, waterlogged. We're both in the water. I kiss your open spine, but you're turned away, eyes fixated on the flames. No pain enough to draw, white lilies, funereal, their edges curled to burn. You swallow salt water, pollen scent that was spent years ago. Fever is fear of future mornings and the holy heel of credit, when on this day I will take your body to the floor and claim as mine to give back to you.
Tell me about Stir. There were two great writers at the Bathurst Uprising. Jim McNeill, whose plays later got him released and he drank himself to death, wrote a great play called Jack, in which two inmates fight over a sex doll, and the creator of the bagged lady taken to a psychiatric ward where everybody begins to sing. This is from McNeill's play. Characters addressing the doll. I was fucked, love, really fucked. Not a bit of love, see? I mean none going out of me to anyone else. I was stuffed full of feelings that had nowhere to go. You know what I mean? You understand that? He regards the bag questioningly, nodding, smiling. Course you do. I know you do. Don't know why I ask you that. Wouldn't be here if you never knew all that. Course you wouldn't. Mug I am sometimes, but you know how it is. Living with all these swine. You get rotten yourself. And then being without you all this time, wondering about things, how things are going with you, you know, and the worst part thinking about the way you'd change. It's funny, but the clock sort of stopped for me. I mean, the day they put me in here, but not for you out there. So when I ever saw you again, you'd be different, older, and you wouldn't have that hair. Remember what I used to call you? Midnight after your hair. Jesus, you had the blackest hair in the fucking world. I wrote a poem. It's about your hair and never seeing you for a long time. Hard to explain, but it was just that I thought that your hair wouldn't be so black by the time I saw you again, except it wouldn't change so long as I never did see it, so long as I only had to see you always like you were. Midnight, anyway, see if you like it. Higher. Time will thread its silver through the dark falls of your hair, tracing in fine filigree the years we could not share. But for me our love is locked, and I still see you there, laughing free and loving with me, midnight in your hair. I mean shit, I'm no good at doing it, but that's how I've been feeling. Anyway, I wrote it for you. Hope you like it a little bit.
In 1970, a riot broke out at Bathurst Jail in Australia. Starting as a sit-in in demand of fairer treatment and improved conditions, tensions rise, and after a few days the inmates embark on a campaign of destruction inside the prison. An inmate climbs over an internal fence and is shot at. This sends the riot into overdrive until the atmosphere eventually calms and the inmates return to their cells. Officers talk among themselves about wanting quick reprisals. A senior officer learns of this and reports it. His seniors respond by removing him from the jail. The new officer in charge of the jail gives the order that any prisoner who resists coming out of his cell faces the baton. The first inmate emerges from his cell without trouble to hear the words, "You were pretty tough yesterday. Let's see how tough you are today. Cop this." Officers then carry out a mass beating of the inmates. On their release, some of the inmates who witnessed the riot speak via local media and legal routes. The officers involved close ranks, threatening other officers tempted to speak out. The severity of the incident led to the prisoner beatings by the officers at Bathurst, to be known as the Bathurst Batterings. Bathurst Jail, or Bathurst Correctional Complex, was founded in the late 19th century. A lion's head sits atop the welcome gate, a key between its jaws. According to the inmates, when the lion opens its mouth and the key falls, all cell doors within the prison will open and they can go free. The jail was already notorious at the time of the 1970 incident, having had riots break out sporadically throughout its history. Conditions are abysmal, with no windows in the cells, only bars leaving the cells freezing at night, outdated plumbing that frequently fails, rotten or stale food and stinking flies from an on-site piggery. The oppressive atmosphere is added to by the demeanour of the guards and the inconsistent way they enforce discipline. Letters from inside are restricted and officers dismiss any complaints from inmates. Bob Jewson is serving time on a minimum security wing at Bathurst in 1974, sent down for safecracking. While there, another riot breaks out. At first it takes the same form as the 1970 riot, beginning as a sit-in protest, inmates fed up that nothing has improved. Prison officers repeatedly promise no reprisals for the peaceful ending of sit-ins, but consistently break this assurance. At a screening of Ken Russell's Women in Love in the prison chapel, an inmate takes advantage of the dimmed light and throws a petrol bomb. Officers, unclear who threw the bomb, nevertheless target one inmate. Screams come from the cell, but it's uncertain if the inmate is receiving a beating or trying to incite the other inmates to riot. Whatever the reason, the other inmates respond by throwing more petrol bombs. With chaos breaking out in the yard, inmates engage in a spree of destruction and set fires about the prison. The prison bell tower collapses and a basement refrigeration unit explodes. Inmates throw petrol bombs at approaching firefighters who retreat. The riot eventually calms and the inmates hold their ground, occupying the prison. At this point, the officer in charge, the same officer who was promoted to that position at the time of the 1970 riot, arms those officers still on duty and calls in officers off duty, many of whom have little weapons training. He also receives firm instruction from his seniors not to fire upon the prisoners, but omits to pass this on to the armed prison officers, who open fire on the inmates, hitting many. One inmate is paralysed after receiving a shot through the spine. Another inmate has extensive internal organ damage. Later, an inmate is shot while waving a white flag. After negotiations, the prisoners surrender, having been promised there will be no further use of firearms against them and no reprisals from officers. Prisoners are gathered together in segregation areas within the prison grounds. Prison officers make it clear to each other and their seniors that they are eager to forcefully punish the inmates. Although aware of this, the prison commissioner allows the transfer of inmates to go ahead with no outside oversight. When the time comes, tear gas is used and prisoners beaten as they are ferried from the holding areas to their transport. A prison officer is quoted as saying, "The tension was electric." Suddenly a roar went up from the prison officers and prisoners were going in every direction. Fists were flying, bricks were thrown, batons were used, and the picture was one of struggling, grappling and wrestling prisoners and prison officers. News footage of the prisoners being taken away by prison bus shows someone with a microphone asking a hurried question through a side window. The prisoner reacts with defiance, but states that they are expecting a further bashing as soon as they arrive at where they are being taken. The jail is left in complete ruin. It does not reopen until several years later. Bob Jewson takes his first-hand experience and turns it into a screenplay, originally titled Bathurst, but eventually becoming the film Stir, the first feature of director Stephen Wallace. At the end of the film, this text appears. The writer of this film was a prisoner in Bathurst Jail when rioting prisoners gutted the jail in February 1974. In writing the screenplay, he drew on his own prison experiences and the findings of the inquiries into the Attica and Bathurst riots. Although Attica was looked at as an influence for some shots of the riots, its inclusion here seems to be for fear of legal action, the filmmaker's reluctance to claim Stir as a direct adaptation of what happened at Bathurst, although that is essentially what it is. With Bathurst in ruins, another location was sought for filming in 1979, and an alternative prison was used, prisoners among those used as actors and extras. Stir, a slang term for prison, possibly derived from the Romany word stir, S-T-U-R, an abbreviated form of stirriban, an immovable thing, a place from which you cannot move, or a prison, and staripen, to imprison, ultimately connected to the word stasis. Also, it could have originated as a nickname for Newgate Prison, which was known as Start, a prison notorious for unsanitary conditions and burnt down in riots in 1780. Over time, the term came to be used as slang for prison in general, losing its association with Newgate only. Stir is also a frequently used Australian slang word for someone who provokes or teases with the intent of getting a reaction, with their target more than likely innocent. The film opens with the character of China Jackson receiving a severe beating from prison guards, intercut with scenes of another man watching Jackson's appearance on television, criticising the conduct of the officers and prison authorities. The man watching is clearly troubled, visibly pained and drinking. A strong blue filter is used for these scenes, distinguishing them as apart from the rest of the film, and the following shot confirms that these opening scenes were a flashback to the earlier riot and its fallout. The film's present day begins aboard a prison bus 3 years later, where Jackson once again makes his way to the prison, we later find out for the relatively minor crime of shoplifting. Jewson created the role of Jackson especially for Brian Brown, and having a character present from the start that was part of the previous riot adds a great deal of seething tension. Needless to say, on his arrival the guards make it clear that he's not going to have an easy time. It's made apparent from the start that the guards take a hard line with prisoners. The inmates are also on edge about Jackson's return, not wanting any trouble. Jackson, for his part, just wants to keep his head down, serve his time without incident and get out of there as soon as possible. The man from the flashback scene makes an appearance. Norton, a prison officer played by Max Phipps, is conflicted about what happened during the previous riot, his part in the beatings playing on his mind. He makes an effort to see Jackson is treated fairly and reels in the sadism of other prison officers when he can. Tensions rise among the inmates as the situation in the jail is worse than before the first riot, with guards abusing their position, playing sadistic games with inmates and inventing trumped-up accusations against the inmates to justify inflicting physical punishments. The prisoners gather together and arrange a meeting with senior prison officials wanting Jackson involved, but he refuses, thinking the action is pointless. He's proved correct when the prison governor, stuck in his ways, dismisses the inmates before they have a chance to raise any issues. With inmates increasingly desperate and seeing no other way to get their points across, some call for more extreme action, although others are reluctant to go that far. One of the key sequences in the film begins when a guard pettily refuses to hand over a letter from outside to Jackson. Jackson responds by exasperatingly swearing at the guard and is put in solitary. Norton directly undermines his colleague in front of Jackson, setting himself apart from the other guards. From the start of the film, a war culture is established, with the inmates forming one side and the prison officers forming the opposing side. Here, Norton steps outside the rules of the game, his position and standing the only things preventing the other guards from turning on him. Despite targeting Jackson, the prison officers turn to him and try to use his influence in their favour, calling for him to calm the other inmates. Jackson again feels the pressure of being dragged into something he wants to stay out of, seeing violence coming. Arguably, the scene the entire film pivots around occurs when Jackson's cellmate is unjustly transferred and Norton comes to the cell. Visibly conflicted, Norton momentarily lets his guard down, changing his body language, taking off his hat and sitting back on one of the cell's beds. As Jackson listens silently, Norton simply conveys his side in an effort to gain some understanding from Jackson. It's a short, powerful monologue that gets across the impossible predicament the men find themselves in. Referring to the previous riot, he states that it acted as a moment of revelation, that the guards only have control because the inmates let them, because they are vastly outnumbered. For Norton, the riot brought back the fear of being a new officer, and the beatings were the only way to regain that control, to stop the fear. Norton goes to leave, putting back on his hat and prison officer's demeanour, acknowledging the brief setting aside of his role can only be an interlude. After this, the guards are back to their old tricks, planting an escape plan on an inmate in order to give him a beating, which they do severely. Jackson's attitude hardens as a result, and he reveals to the other inmates that the reason for his dismissal of a sit-in or other form of protest has been because he knew that they would not make any difference. Pragmatically, he proposes that burning the whole prison down is the only way for the inmates to be heard. Norton's insistence that the inmates' treatment needs addressing falls on deaf ears. Officers ransack prisoner cells, enforcing new rules. The inmates decide to destroy the prison. The prison governor is warned of a plot but ignores it. The inmates use the darkness of a projection film screening to start the riot, throwing firebombs. This is broken up quickly by guards who pick out a particular inmate as the perpetrator. Out in the yard, the prisoners are furious, eventually battering down a fence. More firebombs explode, the prison alarm rings, and inmates sweep through the prison in a riot of destruction. The prison guards collect weaponry. Norton is dismayed the riot has broken out at its inevitability and preventability. Jackson rushes to solitary and frees the prisoner locked up there. He proceeds to break every lock on the solitary confinement cells one by one, determined to make the cells useless. Fire rages. Prison guards mobilise at the perimeter. Prisoners are fired upon. Jackson is shot at while still in solitary, taking a bullet to the shoulder. Outside, police and fire trucks arrive and prisoners bring out their wounded. Jackson is dismayed that the officers started shooting at all. A ceasefire is agreed, and it is negotiated that the inmates, who acknowledge that their objective of the destruction of the prison has been achieved, will surrender peacefully without reprisals from the prison officers. The inmates are marched outside, stripped, gathered in holding pens, and kept there stewing until nightfall, when under floodlight tear gas is fired and officers in riot gear and gas masks violently start the transfer of prisoners. A line of prison officers meet the prisoners as they are herded towards their transport, and the inmates are beaten recklessly. Norton loses control and beats Jackson, having to be pulled off him. The film ends with a shot of the prisoners being driven away. The description for the DVD release of the film says, "Stir tells the unflinching story of the bloodiest riot in Australian prison history. Unwillingly finding themselves at the centre of this violent event are China Jackson, a semi-habitual minor criminal wanting to keep his nose clean, and Norton, a warden deeply ashamed of his former treatment of the prisoners and now seeking redemption. Stir shows how both men are ultimately driven to desperate violence when tensions inside the jail build to an explosive finale where the prisoners are caged, jeered, gassed, and then made to run the violent gauntlet of armoured revenge-seeking warders. Harsh, uncompromising, and as violent and unrestrained as the system and men it depicts, Stir is one of the most harrowing and controversial movies ever made in Australia. Here, redemption is perhaps too strong a term to describe what motivates Norton. He feels guilt over what has happened, that's undeniable, but he's also conscious of what the first riot has cost him, being in reputation or the fact that people stopped speaking to him. He is portrayed as someone wanting to get on with his job, and having a culture of sadism, violence and constant opposition within the prison makes this more difficult when the job is a taxing one already. Added to this are genuine feelings that the mistreatment of the prisoners has gone too far. In any prison, the dynamic of prisoners versus those with authority over them dominates, but here control and discipline is being used as a mask for cruelty and exploitation past any acceptable level. The underlying theme of the film is one personified by the character of Jackson, that most prisoners begrudgingly accept their time served, and it is only when blatant injustices occur that situations like the one portrayed in Stir arise. The commonalities between Jackson's character and that of Norton are made plain, although not overplayed, and it is the study of how these men are trapped in their own specific ways that is central to the film. A quote from the director Stephen Wallace. Bob Jewson said one thing, and I think this is what we tried to make the theme of the film, although it was very hidden, that riots don't happen out of the blue. The prison authorities make you believe that all these criminals that are incarcerated are at all times dangerous and they're trying to get out. But Bob said that's never true. Most of them have accepted their lot and they're trying to serve their time. They only get into a riot situation when they're treated badly and unfairly over a long period. He said most people don't want a riot. They know what it's going to mean, longer in jail. Lastly, the Australian actor, writer and director Bob Ellis, I think accurately, describes Stir as a furious, foul-mouthed, open wound of a film.
Got them all. They're gonna bash as soon as we get the long tape. Do anything. Listen, fellas, if you get bashed, ask for George Peterson. He's a member of Parliament. George Peterson. We'll get him out at Parramatta tomorrow. Rightio. We'll be going to Long Bay. Well, he'll be there too. Rightio.
Thomas Cooper spent time in prison for his involvement in riots in the cause of political reform. Sentenced in 1842, while serving his time, he completed The Purgatory of Suicides, a prison rhyme, which was published in 1845, shortly after his release. His introduction, or advertisement as he puts it, gives an idea of his experience of prison life and what state of mind it left him. The first idea of creating a poem in which the spirits of suicide should be the actors or conversers arose in my mind 10 years ago, but a line might never have been composed except for my imprisonment, and the political strife in which I have been engaged has certainly given a form and colour to my thoughts, which they could not have worn had my conceptions been released in an earlier period. My persecutors have, at least, the merit of assisting to give a more robust character to my verse, though I most assuredly owe them no love for the days and nights of agony I endured from neuralgia, rheumatism, and I know not what other torments, occasioned by a damp sleeping cell, adding to the generally injurious influences of imprisonment. He goes on to insist on his innocence, furiously railing against the crookedness of the judiciary and the threat of transportation to another country, something which befell others involved in the same incident. Extract from Book 3. O couldst thou bear that dark captivity, from whence released none ever yet returned, to tell its secrets, how our dreams would flee? Was it to know death's truths in life that yearned the hoary Celt, who on the cromlech burned his brother, hymning thee, the sky-throned god? For ages man thy huge grace shrines hath spurned, mocking thy worship, but like all who trod earth then in dreams, still dream the children of the clod. And thou, thyself, all glorious as thou art, supernal sun, what art thou but a dream? A splendid vanity, a glittering part of the vast aggregate of things that seem. How know I that with veritable beam thou dost illume earth and her sister spheres, or whether they and thou, mere fictions, teem from mind, and thy great glory but appears, not is, and will, with thy beholders, fade with years? Hath mind more truly substance then than thou, great sun? O how poor human thought doth mock itself! I think I see, I think I know. What further? Naught to worms. Although ye knock at truth's dark barriers, they will bear the shock till doomsday, if it ever come. If sleep eternal comes instead, then at a stroke, away it will hope, faith, and doubting sweep. And if we cease to be, why, we shall cease to weep. Alas, the soul does seek to gather balm, in vain, from barrenness. Alternative so frigid, blank, and bare, affords no calm to him whose heart desires for aye to live, and yet doth palpitate, despond, misgive, more than it hopes. Resplendent light, now wanes thy beam, yet who the morrow shall survive to see, shall thee behold gilding the plains, and hear thy gladdened birds rechant their joyous strains. Hark, 'tis the turnkey, and whose bars and bolts jar their harsh summons to ray nightly nook. Farewell, grandson, how my weak heart revolts at that appalling thought, that my last look at thy great light must come. Oh, I could brook the dungeon, though etern, the priest's own hell, aye 1,000 hells, in thought unshook, rather than nothingness. And yet the knell, I fear, is near, that sounds, to consciousness farewell. In his autobiography, Cooper describes his fight for writing privileges and the conditions he was subjected to. My poor dear wife was in a very dangerous state, worn almost to a skeleton, always in bed and incapable of helping herself, and I had to leave her in that state. I had told her that I expected 2 years' imprisonment because they had given Kappa that sentence. One of her sisters, with other women who stood around the bed, as I stooped to give her, as I expected, the last token of love in this life, burst into an exclamation of amazement as they saw her glance upwards and smile, with an expression that meant, "We shall meet in heaven." In court, Cooper pleads for access to writing materials. I sprang up immediately and begged before the court was broken up that the judges would allow me literary privileges during my imprisonment, as the chaplain of Stafford Gaol had forewarned me that if I came there again as a convicted offender, I would have nothing but the Bible and prayer book to read, and could not be allowed to write or receive a letter or make use of pen, ink and paper, since all that was contrary to the rules of the prison. "We have no control over the rules of any gaol in the kingdom," replied the Lord Chief Justice, as haughtily as ever. "At present you are committed to the custody of the Marshal of the Marshalsea, so get down, sir." I vowed that I would break down the system of restraint in Stafford Gaol and win the privilege of reading and writing, or end my life in the struggle. I thought I should never see my dear wife again. She would die before I left the prison, so I need not be careful of my life on her account. And if I could not write the poem on which I believed my whole future on earth depended, if it were to be honourable, it was not worth enduring 2 years' dismal and unrelieved imprisonment to come out in rags and with a ruined constitution. My resolution was at once put to the test when we reached Stafford Gaol again. My box, in which I had a considerable number of books, was taken from me, and one of the turnkeys demanded the key to it. I refused to give it him, and he said he must take it from my pocket. "Do, if you dare," I said. "If you attempt it, I'll knock your teeth down your throat." And I said it in such a way that he slunk aside and said no more. Each cell had a stone floor, was simply long enough to hold a bed and broad enough for one to walk by the side of it. An immense slab of cast iron forms the bedstead, and it rested on 2 large stones. A bag stuffed so hard with straw that you could scarcely make an impression on it with your heel formed the bed. 2 blankets and a rug completed the furniture. We had to take all the water we drank from a pump in our day yard, and it was so bad that we had to let the bucket stand a long time that all the unmentionable stuff might settle to the bottom before we could use the water. The reader must understand that our day room was not a palace. The floor was stone slabs, and the wind assailed us in every quarter. It was a place to create toothache and neuralgia daily. I began to feel very apprehensive for the consequences if I should have to sleep another winter on the bag of straw and iron slab, in that cold shivering hole where the water trickled down the walls in damp weather. I was tormented with neuralgia of the head. I was often obliged to lie on my back a whole day with neuralgia of the heart, and I told the governor and the surgeon that I believed it would end my life if I had no better sleeping place. Cooper embarks on the battle of wills with the prison authorities as soon as he arrives, eventually gaining permission to undertake his writing project. The creation of my Purgatory of Suicides I have called my great business in the jail. And so it was, for it employed a great part of my thought, and absorbed some mental effort of almost every day I spent in Stafford Gaol. In the morbid condition of feeling and thought that grew to be natural in the prison, I fell to trains of reasoning about moral evil and the pain I suppose to be so prevalent in creation, such as the reader will occasionally find in my prison rhyme. Extract, Book 5. Hail, eldest night, mother of human fear, vague solitude where infant man first felt his native helplessness. Beneath those drear and solemn coverture he, trembling, knelt to what in thy vast womb of darkness dwelt unseen, unknown, but with the waking sun shouting, sprang up to see glad nature melt in smiles, triumphantly his joy god run up the blue sky, and light's bright reign again begun. Hail, starless darkness, sterile silence, hail. Would that over chaos thy wide rule had been perpetual, and reptile man's birth wail had never been heard, or over huge, obscene, and monstrous births of ocean or terrene, for ever thou hadst brooded, so that light had never mocked mortals, nor the morning sheen broke thy stern sigil to give baleful sight to man, whose look upon his fellow is a blight. With troubles, contests, perils myriad fold, and threatening prospect of a baleful end by the vile halter in the dungeon cold, or on the transport shore without a friend to sympathize but hordes of slaves to rend, even in its death pangs the lorn exile's breast, with brutal taunts, O let him reprehend that knoweth none of these, but here confessed shall stand my sentence while I am a dungeon guest. Cooper's poetical works were published as a collection in 1877, republishing The Purgatory of Suicides. By this time Cooper had embraced deep religious belief in contrast to the impassioned scepticism that characterized his period in incarceration. At the opening of the collection he addresses the reader. The Purgatory of Suicides has been several years out of print, and although the demand for it has been considerable, I could not sooner bring myself to consent to its reissue, from the fear lest passages in the poem which give me pain, by reminding me of past errors, might also give pain and perhaps do harm to others. Prolonged reflection leads me, at length, to the conclusion that I ought to banish that fear, now such errors have been repeatedly confessed and openly abandoned. Adding that he feels apologetic to his religious friends for reissuing such a work, he then goes on to say, I am not disposed, however, to adopt the strain of mere apology in this address to the reader. I hold that the great cause of human freedom and human right demands that I do not help to consign my prison rhyme to oblivion. The oppression of the poor drove me to champion their cause, and consigned me to a jail, but the power of oppression could not subdue me, and I must take care that the fact is preserved as a lesson to oppressors in the future. Nay, I feel I ought to say more. The gift of genius is God's gift, and ought not to be regarded carelessly and thanklessly by its possessor. I feel that I should be doing wrong if I consented that my book should be thrown away. It does not contain one line of aspiration for liberty which I would destroy, for my heart, thank God, beats as strongly for human freedom in my age as it beat in my youth.
'20th century personified, gang-raped from childhood, beaten free of a testicle by prison guards, Karl Panzram rapes and slaughters his way across the world, planning to hijack a train, fill it with explosives, and false flag a foreign attack, causing a great war, one that's on its way anyway. I wish you all had one neck, and I had my fingers around it. He insists on execution at trial and heckles the hangman for moving too slow. Congested by his rank into a delinquent calf at the altar of the state, Jack Henry Abbott avoided guards who took a liking to his resilience. He was a product of their making, a number before he could come, born from a tampon rolled in glass, faced like a venereal battering ram. He lived pitted in the constipated bowel of system after system. First words lost through a vesicular film. The guards took turns starving him. His eyes stopped adjusting to distances overall. The muscles behind them atrophied, and he needed to stand close during a conversation so he could see your hands. He was more skull than man. His eustachian tube opened willy-nilly, so the voice in his ears sounded ridiculous. If someone on his block presented the tiniest neurosis of an issue that might bloom as future conflict, he preempted their burgeoning passive-aggressiveness by automatically shivving them to death. He didn't want to have to always be spontaneously defending himself over some stupid issue that could have been resolved sooner. 2 revelations accompanied the pleas of those dying beneath him. First he thought they cursed the pain. Then he realized it was an acknowledgement of communion. Their receding proposals held a meaning worse than marriage. You stole another animal from existence to join an elite league, rendering yourself aloof from the charge of such knowledge. That the act meant nothing conversely enhanced the product you made fill a box. He memorized arteries by experience. The scant shadow play during his bouts of confinement became a language only the bugs he knew were capable of punctuating with grammatical efficiency. He usually cohered himself to the cadence of a barked order because it was how he learned human temperament. When no one fucked with him for a while, they let him use the mail. He established contact with a series of writers who seemed as if they might have or had already stabbed someone, and he sold them a story that helped them feel part of the tutorial for badasses. Communism became an appropriate fringe for the fucked during that zeitgeist. Paroled only partly through the influence of recommendation and the supposed literary merit no noticeable contingents of society actually cared about, Jack shared a room of beds in a ghetto halfway house. A week later, he was robbed at knife point before his curfew mattered. The mugger failed to notice the preternatural calmness of his mark. It took everything in him not to engage, despite the fickle support of a literati who brought him their zoo-like marvel and a menial punk research job. Every second he was free was a battle to stay straight. Every retro tough guy New York slouch who knocked shoulders with him added to the counter above his head. He never strived for gloating dominance. He wanted the threat made quiet and to move his life forward along an unmolested timeline. The effort required to wrench every living thing on the street into a hell where they could see him, carried with it a potential ecstasy, a comfort beyond sadism, beyond the endorphins released once a blade had solved its path in meat. After the second mugging, he stopped sighing and armed himself. At least he could get some run-off writer pussy before they sent him back. He had 2 lined up, one a European duchess who sneezed coke into his mouth, dining them over a possibly unrequited fuck tension. Another would-be artist half-wit waiter, lost in a strong-arm acting role, took a bully's interest in Jack. Fucking with someone's tray, even if the meal on it was primarily saltpeter, demanded resolution. Jack did some arithmetic with how much muscling he could abide in front of females, and was uselessly nice for a minute. The prick masqueraded in his apron, a surface-level challenge, short-order masculinity, backing down once confronted, then overcompensating with a suggestion they take it outside, bouncing all over Jack before he could place an order, humiliating him to swoop in on those he courted, to thump his chest about what a man it took to ladle fucking soup all night. Jack stood up, set the other waiter aside, and needed to know, with fortified adrenal dispensation, how this fucking guy's issue would amount. Now the bastard was playing games with what taking a piss meant. He'll take Jack outside so he can piss on him so they can piss. He showed Jack a knife behind the counter, perhaps as his last joke on Earth. As soon as they exited the building, Jack squared him away, no issue, once in the chest, and good. He folded as those who mind your business should. You act like you own people because you made a choice against their demeanor, and don't cry about what happens next. Jack's follow-up book, also written in prison, was a downfall-era Lenny Bruce autism study about what happened at the restaurant. Everyone lost interest. A few years later, he fit through his makeshift noose as if by mandate, earning a long-owed relief, alone, without assistance. Poet Bob Kaufman, is jailed for walking on public grass. Kennelled too tight in overcrowded conditions, convicts at the New Mexico State Penitentiary, soon to be known as the Devil's Butcher Shop, seize control of the facility, snatching pharmaceuticals high out of their minds, dragging an acetylene torch from shop to open the bars of cell block 4 where snitches have been isolated. Taunted for hours cell by cell about the fate awaiting them, each snitch must listen to the previous occupant, scorched alive as white-hot iron gets jammed in their skulls and genitals, which are promptly removed and shoved down their throats, eyeballs melted till gases build pressure intense enough for the interior contents to explode. Severed heads are carried to and fro like contraband, wading through a river of blood, excrement, and decay. Near 40 bodies made example of, the rat on its roast, rot wall to wall, damaged beyond fumigation. The politics of the yard, detailed by Edward Bunker, Chopper Reed, Malcolm Braley, Brendan Behan, and most beautifully by Ernest Brawley, wherein an outsider fish introduces idealistic upheaval to the system fellow convicts operate under for contraband and everyone suffers as a consequence, becomes public knowledge. Eldridge Cleaver's infidel Lazarus prisoner, chided for bothering to live past a certain age without revolutionary self-sacrifice, details bleak truths between whites and blacks, men and women, fatalistic horror, one big institutional rigging from the genes out. Miguel Pinero's Short Eyes shows the existential result of wasting kindness on a beast. Kiss of the Spider-Woman infuses elegance and betrayal. Janae as moving political melodrama. Titicut Follies whips through the chaos of a mental ward, the hapless cycle, the ruse of treatment. American Skin, the great 90s novel of gangs in prison, explores hell as a teenage lark, a punk reverse skinhead Bildungsroman, a wild goodbye before jail becomes closer to a universal state. Long before Breaker Morant holds hands with a fellow soldier and walks into the sunset to be executed over nothing. Walls, with no consideration, no pity, no shame. They have built walls around me, thick and high, and now I sit here feeling hopeless. I can't think of anything else. This fate gnaws my mind, because I had so much to do outside. When they were building the walls, how could I not have noticed? But I never heard the builders, not a sound. Imperceptibly, they have closed me off from the outside world. C.P. Cavafy.
I could stand and look at the stars all night, where tides run in wreaths to the rivers and rills, where the sea breezes play with the wind from the hills, where by land and by sea man can go where he wills. I'm a free man again, and a free man of right. I could stand and look at the stars all night. For months that were years they have prisoned my stars. My silver-veiled Venus and red-hooded Mars were fettered and framed by the merciless bars that shaded their glory or shivered their light. I will stand and look at the stars all night. I will wait in the shadow and leave the tower, till morning shall come with his magical power. Perhaps in the flame of that wonderful hour the prison shall tremble and pass from my sight. The Prisoner Released by Colonel H.C. Parsons.
The following are quotes by Jean Genet. To achieve harmony and bad taste is the height of elegance.
A man must dream a long time in order to act with grandeur, and dreaming is nursed in darkness.
I recognize in thieves, traitors, and murderers, in the ruthless and the cunning, a deep beauty, a sunken beauty.
I wanted to swallow myself by opening my mouth very wide, and turning it over my head so that it would take in my whole body and then the universe, until all that would remain of me would be a ball of eaten thing which little by little would be annihilated. That is how I see the end of the world.
Beauty is the projection of ugliness, and by developing certain monstrosities we obtain the purest ornaments. It's a true image, born of a false spectacle.
My heart to my mother, my cock to the whores, my head to the hangman.
Anyone who has not experienced the ecstasy of betrayal knows nothing about ecstasy at all.
Hell has degrees, so does love.
Repudiating the virtues of your world, criminals hopelessly agree to organize a forbidden universe. They agree to live in it. The air there is nauseating. They can breathe it.
Beauty has no other origin than a wound.
What we need is hatred. From it our ideas are born.
Saintliness means turning pain to good account. It means forcing the devil to be God.
The following are quotes by Marquis de Sade. We are no guiltier in following the primitive impulses that govern us than is the Nile for her floods, or the sea for her waves.
Nature sufficeth unto herself. In no wise hath she need of an author.
Beauty belongs to the sphere of the simple, the ordinary, whilst ugliness is something extraordinary, and there is no question but that every ardent imagination prefers in lubricity the extraordinary to the commonplace.
Social order at the expense of liberty is hardly a bargain.
All universal moral principles are idle fancies. True happiness lies in the senses, and virtue gratifies none of them.
The greatest pleasures are born of conquered repugnancies.
Tormented virtue fidgets while vice takes its repose.
If we punished only the crimes we could prove, we would not enjoy the pleasure of dragging our fellow human beings to the scaffold so much as 4 times a century, and that is the only thing that makes us respected.